Welcome to the Dough Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 304, we're going to talk about the FIRE movement. FIRE is Financial Independence, Retire Early. And it's come up in a number of interesting ways recently, and I thought I'd spend an episode talking about what it is, what it's not, and how it changed my life. I changed my life even before there was a thing called the FIRE movement, and it's something that I think everyone should join. You may be in your 50s or 60s and saying, Rob, early retirement passed me by a decade ago. Actually, it didn't. And I think the FIRE movement can help just about anybody in just about any stage of life. So that's what we're going to talk about. And I want to start with a couple of stories, and this is how all of this sort of came to my mind recently. I was at a conference that I go to every year called FinCon. By the way, a couple of folks listening to the show were there. And it was kind of a lot of fun to meet them. And, it's my 8th year going, and it's fun every year. And at the conference, and there were sort of two conferences back to back that I attended, but in one of them, Clark Howard was there. Clark Howard is a radio, TV personality, has a website, and he's, a personal finance guy. And, I knew of Clark Howard, had never met him, didn't know his story. And he's a great guy. And I got to hear him speak, and then he and I chatted a little bit afterward. And I got to learn a little bit about his story. And his story, in a nutshell, is this. He went to college, and he went to school at night. His plan was for his parents to pay for college, and they ran into some financial struggles, and they couldn't. So he went to school at night and worked. When he graduated, he decided he was going to live on every other paycheck. Now, he's in his 60s now. So this was some time ago, but he decided, I'm going to live on every other paycheck. So effectively, he was saving 50% of his take-home pay, and that was his plan. And that's what he did. And in a couple of years, he was able to buy a foreclosure. And then he decided to start a travel agency. And so he started a travel agency and then opened up another location and then another location. And long story short, by the age of 31, he sold his travel agency company and he retired. He was done. Cashed in, he's out, living in Florida on the beach with his family, loving life. That's Clark Howard. Now, of course, there's more to the story. Because of, I think, some health issues with his parents, he moved back to Atlanta. And one day, a radio station called and said, hey, I know you have this background in travel. Do you mind coming on the show as a guest for one of our radio programming slots, and we talk about travel? Sure. So he goes on the show. They like him. They ask him to come back. He comes back. Eventually, they say, would you like your own show talking about travel? And so, well, sure, why not? And, that kind of just snowballed into what he is today, which is personal finance on the radio, TV. And but one thing he's always done is he's never spent most of his money, even today. He lives well below his means. And he works because he wants to, not because he has to. And he gives a large portion of what he has to charity. And I thought, this is exactly my playbook. That's exactly what I do now and what I hope to do the rest of my life. And so it was fun to hear his story. I didn't know his background. And he's just a genuinely nice guy. But here I thought, here's a FIRE movement guy who predates the actual FIRE movement by several decades. And he had this figured out a long, long time ago. And so that's story number one, Clark Howard. The second story, also from the conference, was a panel discussion around a documentary called Playing with Fire. And it's a documentary that's going to come out, I'm not sure when, but they showed a trailer, and it looked like a great movie. And they had a panel of the folks that produced the movie, but also a lot of folks from the FIRE movement. So Pete from Mr. Money Mustache was there. Paula from Afford Anything was there. Go Curry Cracker was there. If you follow the FIRE movement, you know all of these names. But these are folks that are pursuing FIRE themselves, that blog about what FIRE means and all of the issues that that come with it, including, for example, how to deal with retirement accounts if you retire in your 40s, right? You're not 59 and a half yet, so how do you deal with that issue? And health insurance and all the issues that you have to tackle. They're good problems to have, though, I can tell you that. And so in this panel discussion, Two things I found were particularly interesting. The first is there was this debate between what's more important with FIRE. Is it the FI part of FIRE, financial independence, or is it the retire early part of FIRE? And there wasn't a consensus. I think Pete from Mr. Money Mustache got it right, though. His view was that financial independence is really the goal, but you need the carrot of early retirement to convince people that FIRE is worth pursuing. And I think that's right. The interesting thing is, of all the people that I know that have achieved financial independence at a young age, and to me, early retirement would be anything in your like 30s, 40s, or even 50s, none of them have literally checked out and do absolutely nothing to earn income. They do something. They blog. They do freelancing. They write books. They do something that they love that also generates income. Now, I suppose some could say, well, then you're not really retired. There may be some truth to that. I mean, you're certainly not retired in the sense that you're drawing down on your financial assets. But I can tell you from my own experience, boy, it feels really good. I mean, a night and day difference between working the 9 to 5 and doing other work that you love when you want and where you want. So maybe retirement is on a continuum of some kind. I can tell you it's a heck of a lot closer to retirement than slogging to work 5 days a week and working the 9 to 5. So that was the first sort of what I thought was interesting, the debate. And then the next interesting debate was whether when we hit the next bear market, if the FIRE movement will implode, if all of this great talk about early retirement will go up in smoke when the next 2008, 2009, or the next tech bubble or whatever hits us and everyone's portfolios are down by 30%. I actually think the next bear market will have a lot of implications for a lot of different things. The robo-advisors, how will they survive the next bear market? I think the love affair we currently have with index funds will cool. I mean, index funds aren't going anywhere, but they're all the rage, right? I mean, that's where the smart money is because the indexes have by and large done so well over the last decade. And when that changes, then it'll be all active management, and that's the brilliant way to go. And I do think the FIRE movement will have some sort of reckoning, but I don't think it's going anywhere. But that was sort of the debate between the panelists, and it was an interesting topic with very different views. So that's the second story. The third story, in some ways, may be the most fascinating. So my friend Paula from Afford Anything, who has a wonderful podcast, I highly recommend it. I had Susie Orman on the show. Now, I confess I've never read a Susie Orman book. I know who she is. I'm not big into the shtick, but she impacts a lot of people, right? And the first question Paula asked her was, have you heard of the FIRE movement? All right. And Susie said, of course I've heard of the FIRE movement. Sure, right. All right, what do you think of it? What do you think she said? She said, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it, I hate it, and I think she threw in one more I hate it. And she went on to say, in a way that only Susie Orman can, it will be, she gets into that sort of staccato, deep voice, slow, rhythmic, I can't even mimic it, the biggest mistake you ever make. And I'm thinking, you don't know me very well, Susie. I've made some whoppers. Trust me. Retiring early ain't going to be the biggest mistake this guy ever made. Not even, by a country mile. It won't even make my top 10 list. Okay, she hates it. And I listened to the whole podcast, and then the podcast following it, Paula did a great job of sort of giving her own views of the interview. And it kind of blew up within the personal finance space. I mean, it was mentioned in Forbes, CNBC. People were commenting on it. So I recommend the podcast episodes. I mean, if nothing else, for their entertainment value. But I really, upon reflecting on that podcast, that interview, I really think Susie, one, missed an opportunity, and two, did a real disservice to the folks that follow her. And it's not that she didn't raise some valid points, although I think she raised them in an odd way. But the fact of the matter is, the FIRE movement stands for a lot of things that I believe everyone should pursue. Financial independence. why wouldn't you pursue financial independence? Why shouldn't that be a goal? I don't, it baffles me. I think Susie was focused on this. She had this mental image of everyone in the FIRE movement, retiring when they're 32 and never doing another thing the rest of their lives that earned income. And I think in that sense, maybe she doesn't understand the FIRE movement as much as she thinks she does. One of her chief complaint, it was interesting. I learned more about actually Susie Orman in the interview than I did the FIRE movement. She lives in fear, deep-seated fear of things that can go wrong. And I'm a big believer in planning. I'm the guy with the binder in case I get hit by a truck, right? But you can go too far. And I mean, one of her, just to give you a flavor, and I do hope you listen to the podcast, but two of her objections to the FIRE movement I found curious. And by the way, all of them sort of dealt with really bad things can happen in life. And so you should work as long as you're able to. That's her solution to the fear that bad things can happen. And of course, we all know bad things can happen. But the two bad things that she mentioned others, but these were the two that kind of stuck with me. One was, you really need disability insurance. Disability insurance covers you if you get hurt and can't work, and it'll replace some portion of your income. And said if you don't have a job with income, you can't get disability insurance. And that kind of made me chuckle. It's kind of like saying, you got to have a car. How else are you going to buy car insurance? I think her point was if you're relying on investments for your income, you can't insure your stream of income from investments like you can insure your earned income through disability insurance. Of course, that's not right? I mean, you could always annuitize your portfolio if you wanted to, and that's going to be as safe. That's from an insurance company, right? It's going to be as safe as disability insurance. I'm not suggesting we go out and annuitize our portfolio. I just don't think it's but anyway, that was the first kind of thing that I thought was bizarre. The second one was she kind of ran through this tragedy that could befall any of us, apparently. A hurricane could come in, and of course we've had some hurricanes, and your house could get flooded, so I guess you live on the coast in this scenario, and you might not have insurance. And I'm thinking, well, then again, you might. All right, but fine, you don't have insurance. And then the floodwaters recede, and what comes next? Mold. And you don't have insurance for the mold, so they have to tear down your house. And I'm not kidding. This was one of the objections to the FIRE movement. I don't know. Move to Ohio? I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. Buy insurance, maybe? It just seemed to me that it wasn't a well thought out assessment of the FIRE movement. Not that, bad things can happen. We do need, I have earthquake insurance on my home. I live in Virginia. So I'm a big believer in insurance, particularly over events that I can't self-insure, right? And, I don't want to lose my entire investment in my house if an earthquake should hit Virginia. And you might be saying, well, but what are the odds of that? No, they're not good at all. And that's great because that keeps my insurance costs low, right? I mean, so I'm a big believer in planning. You plan for the worst, you hope for the best. I get that. The whole hurricane, flood, mold, tear down your house scenario, I'm not feeling that one exactly. But, I guess you get insurance. So I really thought Susie missed an opportunity to embrace something that I think stands for a lot of good things. And I think it's absolutely fine to say, if you're going to really retire in your 30s or 40s, or maybe even your 50s, there's a lot of things you need to think about and plan for. I totally agree. But to hate it, you're going to have mold in your house and tear down your house. In fairness, this was an hour-long interview. So if you listen to it, there's a lot more going on. Although I think I've summarized it pretty well. Okay. So those are the three stories that led me to this podcast. And so what I want to do for the rest of the show is tell you my story. And from that story, my thoughts on the FIRE movement. So my foray into the FIRE movement, and the FIRE movement as we know it today didn't exist, but it dates back to 2000. It was then that I made partner at the law firm. So I worked at a firm called Winston & Strawn, which is this international big firm, blah, blah, blah. Was a summer associate, which is what they call you when you work at a firm in the summer between your second and third years of law school. And then I joined the firm as an associate in the litigation group in Washington, D.C. And the partnership track, there's 8 years. So, fast forward 8 years, it's year 2000, I make partner. And I do what I think a lot of people do. Join the country club, bought my wife and I fancy watches, bought my wife and I fancy cars. I spent the money. Now, it wasn't that we didn't save anything. I was maxing out our 401k and saving even a little bit more. But I mean, compared to what we could have saved, I was saving peanuts. I was, living the American dream as some people imagine it, as I imagined it then. The funny thing is what I was really doing, if you want to get into the psychology of it, is I was trying to relive my father's life, who belonged to a country club and had the fancy car and the fancy watches. And don't know that I appreciated that, what now seems quite obvious to me at the time. But that's what I was doing. And you go to 2002, so I've only been a partner 2 years, and it starts to dawn on me. I'm a slow learner, but I eventually get there. After 2 years of this, it starts to dawn on me that I'm not any happier with this stuff than I was before I had this stuff. The other thing that dawned on me is I looked at other partners in the firm that were older than I, and most of them weren't, they were, I wouldn't say they were thrilled with their careers. I mean, it varied, of course, some were, but there were a lot that were unhappy. And it wasn't specific to Winston & Strawn. I think Winston & Strawn's a great firm. And in fact, I ended up going back there at the end of my career. It wasn't about Winston & Strawn. It was just that, the practice of law at a big firm environment just has its advantages, but it has a lot of disadvantages. And I thought, I've only got one life to live. I don't know that I want to do it my entire career at one place doing this. And so in 2002 was sort of the start of what I would call my slow progress towards FIRE. And I would say it lasted about 5 years before I fully embraced the idea of FIRE. And then it was another 5 years after that, no, more like 9 years after that, before I would say I achieved financial independence. So here's what happened. In 2002, I left the firm. Now, getting another job, when you're a partner at a big firm, moving to another job is not easy unless you have a large book of business. But what I did was I went in-house. I went to a company. I went to KPMG Consulting. I'd done a lot of technology litigation at Winston & Strawn. And so I went over to KPMG Consulting to manage all of their technology litigation, and then eventually managed all of their international litigation and disputes. But in doing so, I took a 6-figure pay cut. That was a big pay cut, and we felt it. But what I decided was I didn't want the rat race of trying, at a large law firm, you have the billable hours and you keep them up at 2,000 or 1,800. And if you don't, you're gone. That's just the way it works at big firms. And I thought, I don't want that rat race. And so I took this 6-figure pay cut and I went in-house. And slowly I started to realize that all this stuff that I had acquired just wasn't making me happy. So I started, all this stuff I bought, I started to sell it. I ended up selling my car, which was an Acura TL, which for me was a fancy car. I don't know, some of you might, I don't know what you think of an Acura. I thought it was excellent. I ended up getting, I'm trying to remember, I got a Ford Explorer, a Ford Escort. They don't even make that anymore. It's stick shift, but that may have been before the Tesla, before the Acura. But I got rid of the Acura. I think we just exchanged it for, I just got rid of it because we had a minivan too. And so we had 3 vehicles. I think that's what happened. I got rid of the Acura, canceled the country club membership. And by the way, if you belong to a country club and you enjoy it, I'm not here to tell you to leave the country club. But it wasn't enhancing my life, and it's expensive. Not just the initiation fee, but then the cost to maintain the membership. So I got rid of that. I ended up selling my fancy watch. I had a Breitling, gone. So I started sort of unwinding all of these, in hindsight, ridiculous purchases. And then you fast forward to 2005, and I ended up leaving that job for another job in the government and taking another pay cut. So I'm like going in reverse. But each step I made, my life got better, more enjoyable, it got simpler. All of these things, I think, are embraced by the FIRE movement in one form or another. Every story is different. But I started to unwind the complexity, unwind the large monthly expenses that had to go out the door to maintain this lifestyle. And it wasn't perfect. I certainly had setbacks. But when you move to 2000, that change occurred in 2005 when I went to the government, took another pay cut. It wasn't as big of a pay cut, but I took another pay cut. And it was here that, and I mentioned this before, I was listening to the Dave Ramsey show, which honestly, I've probably listened to it a handful of times in my life, but this was one of them. And people were getting on there screaming that, they're debt free. And that just, I thought, yeah, that's what I want. That was sort of my first aha moment that the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. I had divested myself of all of the crap I'd bought. I said, this is it. That's what I want. I want to be debt-free, but even more than being debt-free, I wanted to be financially free. And they go hand in hand, but they're not the same thing. And so I wrote on that piece of paper that I've mentioned, by 2012, I'll be totally debt-free. That was in 2005. 2007, I started doughroller.net. It wasn't really... I didn't start to sort of track my journey to financial freedom. I wasn't thinking of it that way. To me, it was like, hey, this will be fun. Let's start a personal finance blog. That was about the sum total of my thinking on that endeavor. But it started to make money. And not a lot at first. In fact, not a lot at all at first. But over time, it started to make a lot of money. And we basically didn't spend it. We used it to pay down debt. We used it to save. It didn't change our lifestyle one bit, because by this time I knew that, buying a bunch of stuff wasn't going to make me happier. And most of the rest. I continued the website. I started this podcast in 2013. I did not reach my goal of being debt-free by 2012, but I was debt-free by, I think it was 2016. I would say I reached financial independence probably before I was debt-free. And I define financial independence as having 25 times your annual expenses, pre-tax. So just to make the math easy, if before taxes you live on 100 grand, meaning out of that 100 grand you pay your taxes plus everything else, then financial independence from a mathematical perspective would be you've got $2.5 million in the bank. That's financial independence. And for those of you that may not follow all that, the reason I define it that way, and this is a guideline, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's because generally in retirement, you can take 4% of your nest egg out in year one. In this case, 4% of 2.5 million would be 100 grand. And then each year thereafter, adjust the amount you take out by the rate of inflation. So if it's 2%, the next year you take out 102,000. And you stand a reasonably good chance of having your money last through retirement. So that's the idea behind that rule. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then, paid off my debt, ended up selling doughroller.net, as you know, but I'm still around. They haven't thrown me out on the street yet. Here I am on the podcast. I'm doing some other things. It's funny. When I sold Dough Roller, I assumed I would be living off of my investments going forward, and I started to plan for that. But as it's turned out, I'm doing a few other things that's earning enough money. We don't spend a lot, and so we just continue to live off of a little bit of the income that I make and that my wife makes. She does some part-time work for the gym where we train, and we train, by the way. We don't work out. Although my back is killing me today. I was supposed to go to the gym in an hour. I won't be there. In any event, so I'm not actually living off of our investments. They're just sitting there, which is great. That's what I want them to do, just sit there. And yes, I put them all in, with a few exceptions with stocks, I put them all in index funds. And that's sort of my FIRE story. I've never considered myself sort of part of the in crowd of the FIRE movement. I know the folks that are in the FIRE movement. I see them once a year at FinCon. By the way, next year in September, it's in Washington, D.C. Of course, I live in Northern Virginia. I would love to have as many Dough Roller podcast listeners at FinCon. Even if you don't have a blog, I think it's a great conference to go to, and maybe we can figure out something to do together as a group. So put that on your calendar next September 2019. That would be a lot of fun. I don't really kind of view myself as sort of on the inside of the FIRE movement. And some could say, I've got the FI part of it, but I'm still not technically retired in the sense of living off my investments. That's true. And that's fine. That's okay. I mean, retirement, the notion of retirement today, is changing, particularly with the ability to work from home, the ability to work from really anywhere where there's an internet connection, depending on what you do, I think has fundamentally changed how we see retirement. And I'm okay with that. I have no desire to stop doing anything that earns an income. But what I want to do are things that I love, and I want to be able to work when I want to work, where I want to work. And the great thing is, if I want to quit for a year and do nothing, I can do that. Not a problem. So I really think Suze Orman, I hope she rethinks it, because she impacts a lot of people. And I think she did her community a real disservice in that interview, a real disservice. But she's going to have to swallow her pride now. It's kind of like Dave Ramsey and his 12% return on stocks. I think it's a pride issue. That's my best guess. And I think with Suze, it might be the same thing. I don't know. But I think she really did her community a disservice in that interview. So anyway, are there things, if you truly want to retire early, meaning do nothing to earn income, and live off of your investments, that you need to think about? Well, absolutely. I mean, of course. And it's something. These are things that the FIRE movement discusses at length. And the first one is insurance. Now, with the Affordable Care Act, it makes buying individual health insurance much easier. It's not cheap, but that's just something you have to factor into how much money you need every year and do your calculations, right? It's just another expense. Same is true. You're not going to get disability insurance because you won't need it, right? Because you don't have a job. But you want to consider long-term care insurance. Now, in our case, well, that's not true. I started to say we don't have it. I do have some at the moment, but long-term we probably won't have it. We'll be self-insured, and that's okay for us, given what long-term care costs. Long-term care insurance it's kind of a racket. There's a lot of things to consider with long-term care insurance, including what the benefit's going to be if you need it. When does it kick in? How long does it last? And the premiums get really, really expensive as you get older. But there are other things to consider. Do you have family that can help if you need the help? Can you self-insure? How much money do you have that could go to long-term care if you need it? Now, this was something else, though, that Suze Orman said. She said she spent something like $2.5 or $3 million. It was like $30,000 a month, I think she said, putting her mom in, I guess, a nursing home. Well, okay, she had the money to make that choice, but I don't think most of us are going to make that same choice. Her point was you need I think at one point she said 300 grand, $300 a year to live on, because you've got all these potential costs of putting your parents in a nursing home, plus your own, say, 100 grand to live on. And it was almost like divorced from reality. It's like maybe she thinks that way because she's worth, as she said many times, by the way, in the interview, tens of millions of dollars. But I don't think regular folk really, that's not really their, front and center, their biggest concern. How am I going to get by on 300 or 400 grand a year in retirement? But again, these insurance issues are things you will need to think through. What she didn't mention, and I think is actually the biggest risk for early retirees, is not insurance. Insurance is sort of the easy thing. It's expensive. You just need to factor in that cost. The real difficulty is this. The 4% rule, what no one or very few people talk about, is that underlying this 4% rule is that your investments still remain heavily in stocks, right? At a minimum 50-50, but probably more like 60 stocks, 40 bonds. Why? Because you have to generate sufficient returns to not only cover that 4%, but then to keep pace with inflation, right? You can't go 100% bonds. The 4% rule won't work. In all of the back testing they do, there'll be a far greater percentage of hypothetical returns, in this case in the bond market, that will cause you to run out of money before you die. That's basically the issue, right? The goal here is to die before your money runs out. And if you're all in bonds or heavily in bonds, the math just doesn't work. So 50-50 at least, probably more like 60-40. And here's the problem, and this is particularly acute if you're retiring in your 30s or 40s or even 50s, is let's say you've got your 2.5 million and you're living off 100 grand, and then your 60-40 portfolio drops by 20%. Well, now you're at $2 million and you're still spending 100 grand a year, right? That gets really scary really fast. Now, when they backtest the 4% rule, they backtest it against all kinds of markets, good and bad. You can certainly expect, if you're retiring in your 30s or 40s, that you're going to have years where you lose 20% several times before you die, right? You're going to go through several market cycles. Heck, if you retire in your 50s or 60s, you're going to go through several market cycles if you, say, live to be 90. And I think it's going to be very, 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 very difficult for folks to stay invested at a 60-40 split if the market's down by 20%. And let's assume you've left a career and you can't go back to it, and you don't really have any other kind of work you can do. Now, I'm making a lot of assumptions. I'm being very negative here, right? I think it's going to freak a lot of people out. And I don't know that everyone's going to be able to withstand that stress. To me, that's the biggest risk of retiring early, if, again, by early retirement, we mean you don't do a thing in retirement to earn income. Now, what I've just described may not apply to a lot of people, right? I mean, take my own case. If, I'm doing things to earn income now, but if I quit everything and 2 years from now I decided I wanted to work again, I absolutely could go find work. Now, I might not go back to a Winston and Strawn. I might not even go back to law, right? But I absolutely could find meaningful work that made enough money to live on, right? So my risk in that sense is not great. But every situation is different. It helps that I have a law degree. It helps that I live in near Washington, D.C. I mean, the number of just government jobs I could go to if I wanted to. It helps that I have this background from running Door Roller for 10 years, so I can go into the journalism space or the online publishing space. So I have options. You may have more options than I have. You may have fewer options. This is something, particularly for early retirees, that I think you should carefully examine and assess your own risk. Personally, I would not just retire in my 30s or 40s and do nothing. I would retire, if I could have, in my 30s or 40s. Actually, I did retire in my 40s. I quit law anyway. I was 49 when I retired from the practice of law. And really, I was about 47 when I went to a part-time schedule and made very little money from law. But I didn't stop all work altogether. I still found other things to do that I enjoyed, that I could do when I wanted, where I wanted, and that produced income that we could live off of. And I think that's the model that I see the most in the FIRE community. And that's a model that I've enjoyed immensely, and I'm thrilled. I don't self-identify as part of the FIRE movement, but that's exactly what I did. And it's terrific. Now, let me kind of wrap up this show with some thoughts on how you achieve financial independence. We've talked about this. You may recall my podcast not long ago about the 7 levels of financial freedom, level 7 being 25 times your annual expenses. How do you do that, right? I mean, like, what kind of numbers are we talking about? Well, it's all a question of what percentage of your before-tax income you save, right? Of course, if you think about this, I called it the slingshot effect. I'm thinking maybe I need to come up with a different name for it. But let's imagine you make you're living off of, or you make 100 grand, or let's say you spend 100 grand, including taxes. And you're saving whatever. Let's just leave that open for a moment. If you can reduce your expenses by 10 grand, so at 100 grand, you need 2.5 million, right? Under our 25x rule. By the way, if you retire really early, you may decide you need 30x, but we'll stick with 25x for our purposes. Let's say you can shave off 10 grand. You stop spending 100 grand, now you're only spending 90. I say only, still a lot of money. Well, what you've done is lowered the bar, right? Because 25 times 90 is less than 25 times 100, right? So 25 times 90 is what, 2.25? I guess, yeah, 250,000 less. Let me just double check that with my calculator. Yeah, 2.25 million. So the goal that you have to reach, you've lowered the bar, right? You've made it easier, right? You've turned a 100-yard dash into a 90-yard dash, right? Everyone else has to run 100 yards because they're spending 100 grand. You don't. You only have to run 90. But it's more than that because now you have $10,000 more to save. So it's like not only do you only have to run 90 yards while everyone else is running 100, you're now faster. You've actually sped up. I don't know, you've got a new pair of tennis shoes. Something is helping you run faster, right? In this case, it's 10 grand. And so every dollar you can shave off of what you spend not only reduces the goal you have to reach, but gives you more firepower to reach it, right? It's a double whammy. I have to figure out my lingo here. Slingshot effect, I picture the spaceship going around the moon, but I'm not sure that's quite right. Double whammy, I'm not sure, that sounds like a negative thing. If you can think of a term for this, leave it in the Facebook group, doughroller.net/Facebook group. I need something. It's just not working for me. But in any event, you get the idea. And so it's a very powerful thing. What I found is, so most people think, yeah, but that's sacrifice. I mean, where am I going to get that extra 10 grand? I'm going to have to eat out less. I'm going to have to, not go on as nice a vacation. I'm not going to buy fewer clothes, buy fewer gadgets. I don't know. You're going to have to do something, right? Well, there's plenty of ways to save money without changing your lifestyle. I talk about that in the money audit. Just Google the money audit. I wonder if Dough Roller comes up first for the money audit. It should, but I don't actually know if it does. Let's check it out. And it does not. Probably too generic. So do money audit and then Dough Roller. That ought to bring it up. First thing is what to do if you get audited. It's the second one, the one and done method of saving serious dough. Now that's a good title. The money audit, plenty of ways to save money without sacrifice. But the other thing I've found is you think it's sacrifice and it's just not. We have a remarkable ability to adapt our level of happiness following good things and bad things. When bad things happen, our level of happiness goes down, but it eventually comes back to sort of our norm. And the same thing is when good things happen, right? That fancy car you bought that you just loved, and it probably did increase your level of happiness for a bit. 6 months later, it's just a car that's taking you to your job. That's all it is. So I don't think the sacrifice is what we think. I think we build it up in our minds to be a lot bigger than it really is. Having said all that, so what do you need? To me, if you can save 20% of your gross income, you'll certainly achieve financial independence in a reasonable amount of time. Let's say under 30 years, which for some of you might say that's crazy. That's not good. 30 years? Are you kidding me? But think about it. If you're 22 and you do that, you've hit FI by 52. And if you can save 30%, I think you're going to do it in 20 to 25 years. And obviously, if you can save more, it's going to really shorten it. Now, of course, that does depend on your returns, right? A 70-30 portfolio since 1926, according to Vanguard, has earned 9.3% average return. But you got to stick with it, right? When the market goes down, you can't bail. And of course, there's no guarantee it'll return 9.3% going forward. So this is all, this is the best information we have, and you're going to adjust it as you go. And you say, well, that's hard. They're saving 20%, 30%. Yeah. I think it tends to be easier than you think it's going to be. But I'm not here to tell you it's easy. I mean, think about it. We're talking about achieving financial independence in 20 to 30 years. Of course it's not easy. No, it's not. And I'm not going to pretend that it is, but I do think it's doable for, say, middle-class folks. I mean, if you're struggling to get by and barely making enough to feed your family, you have different things to deal with before you start talking about achieving, some level of financial independence in 20 to 30 years. And I get that. But I think for most people listening to this podcast, it's absolutely doable. And by the way, if you're listening and you're like, whatever, in your 40s or 50s, and you're saying, Rob, I'm just getting started, you need the FIRE movement more than ever, right? Because you're going to have to do what the FIRE folks do starting today so that you can retire when you're 65 or 70, right? And that's going to require some choices. But I think many of these choices that seem like sacrifices at the time, you're gonna find out, I'm just as happy. I thought this would be a huge sacrifice, and it's not. That's part of like the four pillars of that I recorded in the last episode. I don't think we're not particularly good at knowing what's going to make us happy. We think we know what's going to make us happy, and we're wrong a lot of times. That's why you hear stories of people constantly chasing the next thing because they ain't happy, and catching the next thing, it gives them some level of satisfaction for a bit, but then their level of happiness just goes back to whatever steady state they have, and they look to chase the next thing to try to make them happy. And by the way, I'm as guilty of that as anybody. So I speak from experience. So there you go. That's my sort of high-level take on FIRE, my own personal experience with FIRE. And if you're interested in learning more, just Google the FIRE movement. You'll find tons of blogs. Obviously, Mr. Money Mustache, Afford Anything, Go Curry Cracker. If you Google the FIRE movement, and I'm just going to do this real quick. Let me just do FIRE movement. The first thing that comes up is this Susie Orman interview. Oh my goodness, she's going to have to walk that one back. By the way, there's a Reddit thread for FIRE movement, and some of the blogs. Let me just see which ones I know. Interesting. Well, Mr. Money Mustache, of course, right? Early Retirement Extreme. That's another good one. And I mentioned some others. So and once you dig into some of those, then you'll find more and more and more resources. I think in some way we all should embrace the FIRE movement as much as we can, because it stands for a simple life, high savings rate, simple investing, and, well, realizing that until next time, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.